In today's English lesson, we have a few things to talk about. The government is changing quickly. President Trump has just won the election and he will become our new president in about 2 months. Before he becomes president, he needs to pick people that will help him. We might call these people advisors. And one of the biggest advisors is called the Secretary of State. In this English lesson, we will talk about President Trump's pick for Secretary of State. It's a man named Marco Rubio. We'll talk about what Secretary of State does. We'll talk about Marco Rubio, and we'll talk about how somebody gets confirmed as Secretary of State. But first, we should take a look at this news clip that contains a lot of advanced vocabulary that you might find on the IELTS or TOEFL exam.
President-elect Donald Trump's Republican Party will control both houses of Congress when he takes office in January. Republicans had already secured a majority in the U.S. Senate, and Decision Desk HQ on Monday projected they would hold at least 218 seats in the House of Representatives, with 8 races yet to be called in last Tuesday's election.
In the news clip, they talked about some races that were yet to be called. In other words, they haven't been decided yet. Nobody knows who won that race. They are so close. Sometimes there needs to be a recount. That is when the votes are counted again. Let's talk about a sentence that uses yet to be called. There are still several congressional races yet to be called. Maybe we should talk about that word congressional. It's an adjective. It comes from the word Congress. Congress has 2 parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. But the House of Representatives is so long, most people just call it the House. The Senate and the House of Representatives both combine to make Congress. Congress meets in the Capitol building, and that, of course, is in Washington, D.C. And it looks like both the House and the Senate are going to have a Republican majority. The majority means more than 50%. This is going to make Donald Trump's life a lot easier. He wants Marco Rubio to become the next Secretary of State, but he can't make that decision alone. He needs the Senate to confirm Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. But since Congress, the president, and even the Supreme Court will be a Republican majority, things can get done pretty quickly. The Senate will probably agree with most of President-elect Donald Trump's picks.
President-elect Donald Trump's Republican Party will control both houses of Congress when he takes office in January. Republicans had already secured a majority in the U.S. Senate, and Decision Desk HQ on Monday projected they would hold at least 218 seats in the House of Representatives, with 8 races yet to be called in last Tuesday's election. The red sweep will enable Trump to push an agenda slashing taxes and shrinking the federal government.
In the news report, they talk about a red sweep. Let's get the definition for what a red sweep is. It's when many people from the Republican Party win in an election. The recent election ended in a red sweep, which helped Marco Rubio gain support for Secretary of State. I'm not sure why these colors are the way they are, but Republicans are red, Democrats are blue. If Democrats would have won big, you might have heard the term a blue wave. How about that for a sentence? It's written in a tense you don't hear often, but that sentence is written in the past conditional tense. If Democrats would have won big, you would have heard the term a blue wave. They also used the term enable. What does that mean? To make something possible or give someone power to do something. Maybe a strong cup of coffee is enabling you to study with this English lesson. As Secretary of State, Rubio would be enabled to shape the country's foreign policies. Yeah, we will talk more about what the Secretary of State does a little later on in this English lesson. You might hear agenda when you're watching the news and listening to politics, but it is a plan or a set of goals. Donald Trump's agenda right now is filling his cabinet. His cabinet is a group of his closest advisors or helpers. Marco Rubio's agenda includes strengthening relationships with other countries. Slashing taxes, that means reducing taxes by a large amount. Marco Rubio has supported slashing taxes, believing it will help the U.S. economy.
President-elect Donald Trump's Republican Party will control both houses of Congress when he takes office in January. Republicans had already secured a majority in the U.S. Senate, and Decision Desk HQ on Monday projected they would hold at least 218 seats in the House of Representatives, with 8 races yet to be called in last Tuesday's election. The red sweep will enable Trump to push an agenda slashing taxes and shrinking the federal government. His power will also be backed by a Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative majority. The new Congress convenes on January 3rd before Trump takes office on the 20th.
They also use shrinking, and that means to become smaller. Some of Rubio's supporters believe in shrinking the government to make it work a little better. Convene. Congress is not always in session. Sometimes they are in recess, which we will talk about in just a minute. But when you convene, that means bring people together for a meeting. If Rubio is confirmed, he will often convene with leaders from other countries as Secretary of State. A big job of Secretary of State is working with other countries. The opposite of Congress convening is when Congress is in recess. When Congress isn't convening, we say they are in recess. And they don't work that many days throughout the year. The House is in session about 130 to 160 days per year. The Senate, about 160 to 190. Remember, there are fewer senators. There are 2 senators for each state. We have 50 states, so there are 100 senators. The more people a state has, the more representatives they will get. For example, I live in a very small state. We have about 1 million people. We have 2 senators because every state has 2 senators, but we only have 2 representatives in the House. California, our biggest state, has 2 senators because every state has 2 senators, but they have 54 representatives in the House. Speaking of the House, remember they meet in the Capitol building, but the part of the Capitol building that the House meets in is called the House chamber. Maybe you have seen this on TV because once a year, the president gives a really big speech from that room. It's called the State of the Union. Let's talk a little bit about who Marco Rubio is. Now, he's a senator from Florida right now. That is his job, but he has been nominated by President Trump to be Secretary of State. Marco Rubio has served as a senator and now may become the Secretary of State. Let's practice a little bit of your English reading. Marco Rubio has been a U.S. Senator from Florida since 2011. He is known for helping make changes to immigration, making the U.S. safer, and supporting tax cuts to help the economy. He has also worked on laws to help Florida and other places after big storms. If he becomes Secretary of State, he will use his experience to help the U.S. be stronger in the world. Yeah, since he is from Florida, that state often gets hurricanes. It's a very warm state with a lot of coastline. A lot of Florida is near the ocean, so unfortunately, they experience a lot of big storms each year. Marco Rubio's parents are from Cuba. They moved to the United States in 1956, before he was born. to seek a better life and opportunities for their family. I'm not sure if you know this, but Cuba is only 90 miles from the state of Florida.
His power will also be backed by a Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative majority. The new Congress convenes on January 3rd before Trump takes office on the 20th. Sources also said on Monday that Trump has selected U.S. Senator Marco Rubio to be his Secretary of State. Rubio was arguably the most hawkish option on the shortlist for the post.
Let's talk a little bit about what the Secretary of State does. It is really one of the most important positions in the United States. Right at the bottom, the U.S. government official responsible for international relations. Again, working with other countries. If confirmed, Marco Rubio would be responsible for handling foreign affairs as Secretary of State. I mentioned this before a little bit, but in the United States, we have 3 different branches of government, and they are all equal. We have the president, we have Congress, and we also have something called the Supreme Court. But when the president wants helpers or advisors, he picks who he wants, but then the Senate has to confirm them. They have to say, yeah, we like that person. It's okay. Now, when Congress or when the Senate is mostly full of Democrats, that would make a Republican president's life very difficult. They might not like who he picks. They might try to get the president to pick someone who is more like a Democrat. Well, with all 3 branches of government having a Republican majority, that is going to make Donald Trump's life a lot easier. To become Secretary of State, Marco Rubio would first need to be nominated by the president. Okay, he's done that. After that, the Senate holds a hearing where senators ask him questions about his qualifications and plans. In other words, to see if he is qualified, to see if he is the right person for the job. If the Senate Foreign Relations Committee approves, his nomination goes to the full Senate for a vote. There are a lot of committees in Congress, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is just one of them. For Rubio to be confirmed, he must receive a majority vote. Remember, majority is over 50% from the senators. If he gets enough votes, he will officially become the Secretary of State. This process is how the Senate approves or confirms many high-level jobs in the government. I've said this before, I'll say it again. I will probably do an entire English lesson about the president's cabinet. You have like Secretary of Education, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Health and Human Services. I think there are about 15 different positions in the cabinet. You might hear State Department, that's a department of the government, and the Secretary of State is in charge. Now, before I said we have 50 states. Guess what? Secretary of State and the 50 states have nothing to do with each other. I know, English is confusing. The U.S. Secretary of State is the government official in charge of managing the country's relationships with other countries. They work on issues like peace, trade, and helping Americans abroad. Do you remember that little virus we had going around the world back in 2020? Well, some Americans were trapped in other countries, and it was the State Department that helped get some of those Americans out of that country and brought them back home. Just to be clear about State Department and the 50 states, the State Department has nothing to do with each state, like my state of Maine. It is part of the federal government, not the state government. The federal government is in Washington, D.C.
Sources also said on Monday that Trump has selected U.S. Senator Marco Rubio to be his Secretary of State. Rubio was arguably the most hawkish option on the shortlist for the post. In the past, he has advocated for a muscular foreign policy to deal with America's geopolitical foes, including China, Iran, and Cuba. Those views have often contradicted Trump, who who has accused past U.S. presidents of leading America into costly and futile wars and has pushed for a more restrained foreign policy. However, Rubio has softened some of his stances over the last several years to align more closely with Trump. The 53-year-old would be the first Latino to serve as America's top diplomat. By selecting Rubio, Trump may help consolidate gains with Latino voters made in the presidential election last week by sending a clear message that they have a place at the highest levels of his administration.
They called Marco Rubio hawkish. So you might hear hawkish and dovish. Let's talk about the difference between the two. Hawkish. It means strongly supporting military action or being aggressive in foreign policy. In other words, they are more likely to start a war. Rubio is known for his hawkish views, especially when it comes to U.S. enemies or foes. Enemies, foes, they mean the same thing. A hawk is a powerful bird. Dovish is the opposite of hawkish. You might hear dovish, like a dove. So if somebody is dovish, they are less likely to want to go to war. They are more likely to want diplomacy. That means talking about things before going to war. Marco Rubio is on the short list of candidates. Short list. A small group of people being considered for a position. Marco Rubio was on the short list of candidates for Secretary of State. Maybe a company is hiring and they are trying to narrow down the list of people they might hire. Well, you might hear them being on the short list. She was on the company's short list to be hired next week. Advocated. Supporting or spoke in favor of something. I advocate for you to study English every day. I am in support of you studying English every day. Rubio has advocated for a stronger military presence overseas.
In the past, he has advocated for a muscular foreign policy to deal with America's geopolitical foes, including China, Iran, and Cuba.
Geopolitical, related to politics and geography, especially between countries. Geography is like where the country is on Earth. Marco Rubio will face many geopolitical challenges if he becomes Secretary of State. We talked about this earlier. The news report talked about this too. Foes. Foes, enemies or opponents. As Secretary of State, Rubio would focus on dealing with the U.S.'s foes. Who are some of the United States foes right now? Oh, I would say Iran, maybe China, maybe Russia. The newscast also mentions Cuba. I don't know about that. Contradicted. That means said the exact opposite. Little kids love to contradict their parents. Rubio's recent statements about foreign policy have sometimes contradicted his earlier views. Yeah, when he was younger, maybe he was a bit more hawkish, but as he gets older, maybe he has become more dovish. Love this word, futile. Futile means it doesn't work or it's pointless. Some say it would be futile to try to negotiate with certain countries, but Rubio disagrees. Studying English while you're tired is futile. Man, teaching English while you're tired is futile. I've had to edit a lot of this video. I hope it is okay. If you think it's okay, do you mind hitting that like button? And if you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe so you never miss another English lesson.
Sources also said on Monday that Trump has selected U.S. Senator Marco Rubio to be his Secretary of State. Rubio was arguably the most hawkish option on the short list for the post. In the past, he has advocated for a muscular foreign policy to deal with America's geopolitical foes, including China, Iran, and Cuba. Those views have often contradicted Trump, who has accused past U.S. presidents of leading America into costly and futile wars and has pushed for a more restrained foreign policy. However, Rubio has softened some of his stances over the last several years to align more closely with Trump. The 53-year-old would be the first Latino to serve as America's top diplomat. By selecting Rubio, Trump may help consolidate gains with Latino voters made in the presidential election last week by sending a clear message that they have a place at the highest levels of his administration.
Restrained foreign policy. This goes back to being not so hawkish, a careful and less warlike approach in dealing with other countries. Rubio may not favor a restrained foreign policy, as he believes in being firm with other countries. Align, that means to match or to agree with. Rubio's views on foreign policy have changed, so they should align with President-elect Trump's. Consolidate. This means to make something stronger or bring things together. As Secretary of State, Rubio would try to consolidate U.S. relations with its allies. We talked about foes earlier, enemies, but allies means friends. I have talked about that in past English lessons. When a business consolidates, they do that to try to get stronger, but unfortunately, sometimes they have to get rid of some people to consolidate, or they have to fire people to consolidate. She lost her job because the company was consolidating. That is the end of this English lesson. If you are looking for more English, right down there is an English lesson I did about Canada and India having a little beef. They're upset with each other. Check it out. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.